August 14, 1857, canebrake plantation, Marengo County, Alabama. A pregnant woman's screams cut through cotton fields as leather tore flesh beneath a live oak tree. Master Edmund Dalton raised his whip again, deaf to pleas, blind to the blood pooling in red clay dust. But then she spoke, not begging, not crying. Her voice dropped to something ancient, something that made even the overseer step back. Within 3 days, Dalton would be found clawing at his own skin, begging his wife to end his life, whispering that invisible hands were peeling him apart from the inside. What kind of agony could transform a man who ruled 300 souls into a screaming, broken thing that even morphine couldn't silence? And why did 5 witnesses swear they saw something impossible the moment that curse left her lips? This isn't a ghost story told around plantation campfires. This is documented medical testimony, sworn affidavits, and newspaper accounts of a Southern master's descent into a hell that no physician could diagnose and no prayer could stop. Something happened under that oak tree that August afternoon, something that turned Edmund Dalton's body into a prison of supernatural torment. Before we go further into this darkness, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored deep dives into history's most brutal and unexplained crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit that like button. Picture antebellum Alabama in the summer of 1857, a landscape where white-columned mansions rose from earth soaked in human suffering, where the cotton economy had transformed the Black Belt into America's wealthiest region on the backs of enslaved labor. Marengo County sat in the heart of this empire. Its soil so rich it stained your hands black, its summer heat so oppressive that the air itself felt thick enough to chew. The Tombigbee River wound through these lands like a dark vein, carrying cotton downstream and carrying nothing but silence back. This was a world of rigid hierarchies, where a white man's word was law, where enslaved people were classified as property in ledgers alongside livestock and furniture, where the legal system existed not to protect the vulnerable, but to preserve the institution that generated obscene wealth for a small planter class. Churches preached that slavery was divinely ordained. Newspapers printed advertisements for runaways alongside notices for estate sales. Medical schools used enslaved bodies for experimental surgeries without anesthesia. The violence wasn't hidden, it was fundamental, structural, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Whipping posts stood in town squares. Slave patrols roamed rural roads at night. And men like Edmund Dalton, educated, church-going, respected members of society, could inflict unspeakable cruelty without consequence, protected by laws that didn't recognize their victims as fully human. This was the world where our story unfolds, where the supernatural would collide with the all-too-real horrors of human bondage. Edmund Caldwell Dalton cut an impressive figure in Marengo County society. At 43, he stood tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of stern, handsome features that painters love to capture in formal portraits. He'd inherited canebrake plantation from his father in 1842, transforming it from a modest 200-acre holding into one of the county's most profitable operations. Nearly 800 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 317 enslaved, people whose names appeared only in his property ledgers. Dalton was a deacon at Marengo Presbyterian Church, a founding member of the local agricultural society, and a man whose word carried weight in county politics. His wife, Catherine, came from Charleston aristocracy and had brought both a substantial dowry and social connections that elevated the Dalton name throughout the region. They had 4 children, educated by private tutors, dressed in the finest clothes that New Orleans merchants could provide. To his neighbors, Edmund Dalton was the very model of Southern gentility, a man who spoke eloquently about duty, honor, and the white man's burden of civilizing an inferior race. He quoted scripture to justify his dominion. He published essays in agricultural journals about efficient plantation management. He even served as a mediator in disputes between other planters, known for his calm demeanor and rational thinking. But those who worked his fields knew a different man entirely, one whose rationality vanished when his authority was questioned, whose calm facade cracked to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. They'd seen the meticulous way he selected his instruments of punishment, the methodical manner in which he administered discipline, and the complete absence of emotion in his eyes when inflicting pain. The official narrative that Edmund Dalton presented to respectable society was one of benevolent paternalism wrapped in economic necessity. He explained his disciplinary methods as unfortunate but essential, arguing in letters to fellow planters and in testimony before county agricultural meetings that enslaved labor required firm management to maintain productivity and prevent the natural indolence he claimed was inherent to the African race. When visitors to canebrake noticed the unusually high number of scarred backs among his workforce, Dalton had prepared explanations that his peers found entirely reasonable. He portrayed himself as a reluctant disciplinarian, claiming he only resorted to the whip when enslaved workers damaged valuable equipment, threatened overseers, or attempted escape, all of which he characterized as theft of his property and threats to the social order. He kept meticulous records that he could present as evidence of his restraint, ledgers showing that he only ordered corrections when productivity dropped below certain thresholds or when specific infractions occurred. These documents made everything appear measured, rational, even merciful by the standards of the time. Dalton also made public displays of generosity, allowing enslaved families to maintain small garden plots, permitting religious gatherings on Sunday afternoons, providing basic medical care through a local physician who made monthly rounds. These gestures were calculated performances for white observers, proof that he fulfilled his supposed paternalistic duties. Fellow planners praised his management style. His pastor commended his Christian stewardship. Local newspapers occasionally featured sympathetic profiles highlighting his agricultural innovations and his role in the community's economic prosperity. The narrative was perfect, unassailable, designed to deflect any moral scrutiny behind a wall of economic, rationalism, and religious justification. But behind Canebrake's genteel facade existed a carefully constructed system of terror and control that went far beyond the whipping post visible near the overseer's cabin. Dalton had designed his plantation's layout with surveillance and punishment in mind. The main house sat on elevated ground with clear sightlines across the fields, while the slave quarters were positioned in a low area prone to flooding, ensuring maximum discomfort and minimum privacy. He employed 3 overseers who rotated shifts, maintaining 24-hour vigilance over the enslaved population. These men weren't just supervisors, they were enforcers trained in psychological warfare. Dalton had built what he called the contemplation room in a windowless shed behind the cotton gin, where enslaved people were confined in complete darkness for days at a time, given only enough water to survive. He maintained a private account with the Nashville Iron Works that specialized in restraint devices, shackles, iron collars with protruding spikes designed to prevent sleep, and a particularly cruel apparatus he'd commissioned himself, a metal framework that locked around the torso and forced the wearer into a perpetually bent position. The plantation's isolation worked in his favor. The nearest town was 7 miles away by terrible roads, and Dalton owned every approach to his property. He'd established relationships with slave catchers throughout 3 counties, ensuring that any escape attempt would be met with swift, violent recapture. Even the enslaved children weren't spared from his system. At age 6, they were assigned to work crews, and Dalton kept detailed notes on which forms of punishment proved most effective on which individuals. This wasn't random cruelty. This was engineered oppression, a machine designed to extract maximum labor while crushing any spark of resistance or hope. When concerned citizens occasionally questioned certain aspects of Dalton's operation, the unusually high mortality rate among his enslaved population, the number of workers bearing visible injuries, or the strange sounds reported by travelers passing near Canebrake at night, he had refined a repertoire of explanations that satisfied white audiences. The mortality rate? Dalton blamed it on the inherent weakness of the African constitution in Alabama's climate, and the unfortunate prevalence of cholera and consumption in the region. The injuries? Accidents inevitable in agricultural labor, compounded by what he characterized as carelessness and lack of attention among workers. He even produced testimony from Dr. Silas Weatherby, a local physician who made regular visits to the plantation and who would certify that all injuries were consistent with farm accidents or self-inflicted. During alleged fits of mania, a diagnosis frequently applied to enslaved people who showed signs of depression or resistance. When travelers reported hearing screams or witnessing punishment sessions, Dalton explained these as necessary disciplinary measures, nothing beyond the standard practices accepted throughout the South. He pointed to legal precedents that gave masters nearly unlimited authority over their human property, citing Alabama statutes that explicitly protected planters from prosecution for anything short of murder. And even murder charges rarely stuck when the victim was enslaved and the accused was a respected white man. Local authorities, themselves slaveholders or dependent on the planter class for economic stability, had no incentive to investigate too deeply. The county sheriff was a cousin by marriage. The circuit judge had purchased cotton from canebrake for years. The system protected its own, and Edmund Dalton understood exactly how to navigate it, using legal frameworks and social connections to construct an impenetrable shield around his cruelty. Central to Dalton's operation was his head overseer, a man named Luther Vance, a poor white Georgian who'd worked his way up from hired field hand to Dalton's most trusted enforcer. Vance understood plantation economics with brutal clarity. His salary depended on cotton yields, and his reputation among other planters rested on his ability to maintain order through fear. He carried out Dalton's punishments with mechanical efficiency, but he also contributed his own innovations to the system of control. Vance had developed a network of informants among the enslaved population, identifying individuals he could manipulate through promises of slightly better treatment or threats against their family members. He'd planted these informants strategically, in the fields, in the main house, among domestic workers, even among the children. This internal surveillance system meant that any whispered plans for resistance, any attempts to organize, any criticism of the masters would be reported before it could take root. Dr. Silas Weatherby served as medical legitimizer for the plantation's horrors, providing diagnoses that pathologized resistance as mental illness and certifying injuries as accidental when his conscience should have rebelled. He benefited financially from his relationship with Dalton and from the medical experiments he was permitted to conduct on enslaved patients, studying the effects of various drugs, testing surgical techniques, all without consent. Then there was Catherine Dalton, Edmund's wife, who played her own role in the machinery of oppression. She managed the household staff with cold precision, employing psychological cruelty that left no visible marks, arbitrary punishments, deliberate humiliations, separating mothers from children as domestic assignments required. She understood that the system depended on white women's participation, their willingness to see enslaved people as less than human, their complicity in daily violence masked as household management. Among the 317 people enslaved at canebrake was a young woman named Cassia, approximately 23 years old, though her exact birth date had never been recorded in any ledger that acknowledged her as fully human. She'd been born on the plantation, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who died during a cholera outbreak when Cassia was 12. In Dalton's property records, she appeared as a single line. Cassia, female, prime field hand, strong constitution, high value. But Cassia possessed qualities that no ledger could capture. A fierce intelligence that she'd learned to hide behind downcast eyes, a deep knowledge of medicinal plants passed down from her mother and grandmother, and a memory that retained every story, every song, every fragment of African heritage that hadn't yet been beaten out of canebrake's enslaved community. She worked the cotton fields from sunup to sundown, her hands perpetually stained and scarred from picking bolls. By winter of 1856, she was pregnant. The father, a man named Isaiah who worked the same field gang, whom she'd married in one of the unofficial ceremonies that enslaved people conducted without legal recognition or protection. Dalton owned Isaiah too, which meant he owned any children they might produce, future property to be assigned to field work as soon as they could walk. Cassia had tried to hide her pregnancy as long as possible, knowing that expectant mothers received no reduced workload at canebrake, that Dalton viewed pregnancy merely as inconvenient timing that temporarily reduced a worker's productivity. By August 1857, she was 7 months pregnant, her body exhausted from maintaining the same brutal pace in 100-degree heat, her future and her child's future entirely in the hands of a man who saw them both as livestock. On August 14, 1857, a traveling Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitfield happened to be passing through Marengo County on his way to a camp meeting in Linden. He'd heard of Edmund Dalton's reputation as a pious Presbyterian and thought to stop at canebrake to request water for his horse and perhaps a brief rest in the shade before continuing his journey. Whitfield was an abolitionist sympathizer, though he kept such views carefully hidden in Alabama. His ministry required him to travel through slave territory, and any hint of his true beliefs would have meant violence or death. He'd arrived at canebrake's main approach around 2 in the afternoon, the sun beating down mercilessly, and was directing his horse toward the main house when he heard sounds that made him freeze. A woman's cries, the crack of leather against flesh, and then a man's voice issuing commands with cold precision. Whitfield later testified that every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to pretend he'd heard nothing, to protect himself by maintaining willful ignorance. But something, conscience, moral duty, or perhaps divine prompting, as he'd later describe it, compelled him to follow the sounds. He dismounted and walked quietly through a grove of pecan trees toward the commotion. What he witnessed from behind a cotton storage shed would haunt him for the rest of his life and place him in immediate danger once he was discovered. Because Whitfield didn't just stumble upon routine plantation discipline, he stumbled upon something that would shatter the careful facade Edmund Dalton had constructed, something that would expose the reality behind all those reasonable explanations and documented justifications. And in that moment, Whitfield became the one person who could testify to what really happened under the oak tree that August afternoon. Reverend Whitfield stood frozen behind that shed, watching Edmund Dalton bring his whip down again and again across Cassia's back while Luther Vance held her arms tied to the oak tree. But what paralyzed Whitfield wasn't just the violence. Plantations across the South echoed with such sounds daily. What stopped his breath was the context he pieced together from Dalton's shouted words. Cassia had requested permission to rest, claiming dizziness and pain in her heavily pregnant belly, and Dalton had interpreted this as laziness, as theft of his time and labor. The whipping wasn't punishment for escape or destruction of property. It was punishment for being physically unable to maintain an inhuman pace while 7 months pregnant. Whitfield watched 20 lashes fall, then 30, Cassia's dress torn to ribbons, blood soaking into dry earth. And then something happened that Whitfield's rational mind struggled to process. Cassia's screams stopped. She lifted her head, her voice suddenly steady and deep, speaking words in a language Whitfield didn't recognize, something that sounded older than English, older than the Gullah Creole he'd heard among coastal enslaved populations. She spoke for perhaps 15 seconds, her eyes locked on Dalton's face, and then she collapsed. Whitfield saw Dalton stumble backward, saw the whip fall from his hand, saw him stare at his own palm as if it had suddenly become foreign to him. Then Vance spotted Whitfield, and the witness's own nightmare began. He was seized, dragged before Dalton, and told in no uncertain terms that if he spoke of what he'd seen, he'd be killed. Dalton's usual genteel mask was gone, replaced by naked threat. Whitfield left Canebrake in terror. His ministry in Alabama effectively ended, but something compelled him to document what he'd witnessed in a letter to an abolitionist newspaper in Boston before fleeing north. Whitfield's letter reached the Boston Liberator in early September 1857, and the abolitionist press seized upon it as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality. But in Alabama, the response was predictable: complete denial and counterattack. Edmund Dalton immediately wrote to the Marengo County newspaper describing Whitfield as a deranged, itinerant preacher with known sympathies for Negro agitation, who'd trespassed on private property and concocted lies to serve abolitionist propaganda. Local authorities, pressured by Northern criticism, conducted what they called an investigation. Sheriff John Hartwell visited Canebrake, interviewed Dalton and Vance, examined the plantation's punishment records, and concluded that no excessive discipline had occurred. The sheriff's report stated that Cassia had received standard correction for insubordination, well within legal parameters of plantation management, and showed no signs of lasting injury. No one interviewed Cassia herself. Enslaved testimony wasn't admissible in Alabama courts, and besides, speaking against a white master would guarantee brutal retaliation. The county medical examiner, Dr. Weatherby, provided an affidavit certifying that he'd examined Cassia 3 days after the incident and found her in good health with injuries consistent with routine discipline. The fact that Cassia was barely able to stand, that infection had set into the deepest lacerations, that she'd lost so much blood she could hardly speak. None of this appeared in Weatherby's official report. The investigation was a performance, a show trial, designed to satisfy Northern critics while protecting Southern property rights. Within 2 weeks, the matter was declared closed. Dalton's reputation remained intact. Whitfield was branded a liar and agitator, and Cassia returned to the cotton fields, her back a landscape of healing wounds, her pregnancy somehow continuing despite the trauma. But those who lived and worked at Canebrake noticed changes in the weeks following August 14th, changes that no official report acknowledged. Cassia had always been strong, capable of maintaining the punishing pace that Dalton demanded. But after the whipping, she moved differently. Not just from physical injury, though the scars would be permanent. There was something else, a quality to her silence that unsettled even hardened overseers. She worked without complaint, her face expressionless, but several enslaved workers later testified that she seemed to be waiting for something, watching Dalton with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. Other women who worked near her whispered that she'd invoked something under that oak tree, something passed down through generations from the old country, from traditions that slavery had tried to destroy but couldn't fully erase. Whether you believe in such things or not, understand that belief itself has power, and on plantations where enslaved people had almost no power over their physical circumstances, spiritual practices and folk traditions provided psychological survival mechanisms and frameworks for understanding suffering. Cassia had called upon something, and now she waited to see if it would answer. Meanwhile, other victims bore their own alterations. Isaiah, Cassia's husband, became withdrawn and watchful, forbidden by both plantation rules and his own powerlessness from defending his wife or unborn child. His hands developed a constant tremor. Other enslaved workers who'd witnessed the whipping or heard about it became more subdued, the violence serving its intended purpose, reminding everyone of their precarious status, their complete vulnerability to arbitrary cruelty. Trauma rippled through the enslaved community, manifesting in nightmares in mothers holding their children tighter, in the particular kind of vigilance that comes from knowing protection doesn't exist. Now, you have to understand the calculated nature of Dalton's violence. This wasn't rage or loss of control. It was systematic, almost clinical in its application. Dalton kept detailed notes on punishment efficacy, recording which methods produced desired behavioral changes and which provoked resistance. He'd studied plantation management treatises that treated enslaved human beings as agricultural problems to be solved through properly calibrated incentives and deterrence. His library contained works by pro-slavery theorists who argued that Africans required physical discipline the way children did, who constructed elaborate pseudo-scientific justifications for brutality. Dalton had experimented with different whip designs, commissioning custom implements from a leather worker in Mobile, some designed to leave minimal visible scarring for domestic corrections, others designed to maximize pain and trauma for public examples. He understood timing. Punishments conducted publicly served as mass intimidation, while private sessions in the contemplation room left no witnesses. He knew anatomy, where to strike to cause maximum pain without damaging organs that might reduce a worker's long-term value. He calculated nutritional minimums, how little food could sustain life and labor capacity without triggering costly illness. His records showed pregnancy tracked as productivity data. Pregnant workers represented temporary reductions in output. Births represented additions to capital assets. But maternal health itself appeared nowhere in his calculations. The whipping of 7 months pregnant Cassia wasn't an isolated incident of cruelty. It was consistent with Dalton's broader methodology. His conviction that enslaved people were property to be managed with the same rational efficiency he'd applied to cotton cultivation. He'd created a system, tested it, refined it, and suffered no consequences for its human cost. But someone was watching who wouldn't be silenced or intimidated into complicity. Dr. Marcus Webb had recently arrived in Marengo County, establishing a medical practice in Linden after completing his training in Philadelphia. At 31, Webb was young enough to still carry idealism, old enough to understand the dangers of challenging entrenched power. He'd grown up in Maryland, a border state where slavery's contradictions were impossible to ignore, where the same people who spoke of liberty and rights owned human beings. Webb's medical training had included anatomy lessons conducted on the bodies of enslaved people sold to medical schools, an experience that had shattered any remaining illusions about slavery's benign nature. He'd taken his physician's oath seriously, to relieve suffering, to do no harm, and he'd deliberately chosen to practice in the Deep South, fully aware of the moral compromises he'd face. When he'd heard about the investigation of the Whitfield allegations, when he'd read Dr. Weatherby's dismissive report, something in Webb rebelled. He understood that Weatherby was lying. No one could sustain 30 lashes across the back while 7 months pregnant without serious medical consequences. Webb was also in a precarious position. He was new to the county, building a practice that depended on relationships with the planter class, and any hint of abolitionist sympathy would destroy his livelihood and possibly his life. But his conscience wouldn't permit silence. He began quietly asking questions, speaking to other physicians, gathering medical literature about pregnancy and trauma, and he devised a plan that required extraordinary courage. He would request permission to conduct medical examinations of enslaved populations, presenting it as research into disease prevention that would benefit plantation owners by protecting their investments. This approach allowed him access to canebrake under the guise of serving Dalton's interests. In late September 1857, Dr. Webb arrived at Canebrake Plantation with official permission from Edmund Dalton to conduct health surveys. Dalton, always eager to present himself as a progressive planter interested in scientific management, welcomed this opportunity to demonstrate his concern for his human property's well-being. Webb spent 3 days examining enslaved workers, documenting illnesses, treating infections, and slowly building trust with people who had every reason to distrust any white man, especially one claiming to help. He deliberately examined Cassia last in the presence of an overseer to avoid suspicion. What he found confirmed his worst fears: massive scarring across her entire back, evidence of infection that had been left untreated, and signs of stress to her pregnancy that could only have resulted from severe trauma. But Webb maintained his professional demeanor, asking questions that seemed purely medical, revealing nothing. That evening, he dined with the Dalton family, enduring Edmund's self-satisfied lectures about plantation management and Catherine's casual racism disguised as concern for her domestic workers' souls. And during that dinner, Webb noticed something odd. Dalton seemed distracted, uncomfortable, periodically rubbing his hands and arms as if trying to remove something invisible. Catherine mentioned that her husband hadn't been sleeping well, troubled by what she called nervous complaints and bad dreams. Webb filed this information away and continued his work. Over subsequent weeks, he made additional visits to other plantations in the area, always including canebrake in his rounds, slowly documenting a pattern of abuse that went far beyond accepted norms even by the standards of slaveholding society. But he needed more than medical notes. He needed legal testimony and witnesses willing to risk everything by speaking truth. Let's pause here because what comes next is where this story transforms from historical horror into something that challenges our understanding of justice, retribution, and the supernatural. Can you handle what's about to unfold? Because this is where Edmund Dalton's world begins to disintegrate, where the carefully constructed systems of oppression encounter something that laws and whips and wealth can't control. I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe is documented in sworn testimony, medical records, and newspaper accounts from multiple sources. This isn't folklore or legend. This is recorded fact that 1857 observers struggled to explain. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed because this channel digs into the darkest corners of history that others won't touch. Drop a comment and let us know. Do you believe in curses, or is there always a rational explanation? Because you're about to face that question yourself. 3 days after the whipping, August 17, 1857, Edmund Dalton woke screaming. Catherine later testified that she'd found her husband sitting upright in bed, clawing at his arms and chest, claiming that invisible hands were touching him, pulling at his skin from the inside. She'd initially dismissed this as a nightmare, but the behavior continued throughout the day. Dalton complained of burning sensations across his back, precisely in the pattern where his whip had struck Cassia. No visible marks appeared on his skin, but he insisted the pain was unbearable, like being flayed alive. Dr. Weatherby was summoned and found nothing medically wrong. No fever, no rash, no physical evidence to explain Dalton's symptoms. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and suggested nervous exhaustion. But the symptoms intensified. By August 20th, Dalton couldn't sleep, couldn't work, spent hours staring at his hands, claiming he could see blood on them that no one else could see. Servants reported hearing him weeping in his study, something unthinkable for a man of his proud nature. Luther Vance and other white witnesses testified to seeing Dalton's behavior become increasingly erratic. He'd suddenly cry out in pain during normal activities, claiming invisible whip strokes were striking him. He began refusing to go near the oak tree where Cassia had been whipped. And most disturbing to his family and peers, he began speaking about guilt, about judgment, about debts that must be paid. This wasn't the Edmund Dalton they knew. the rational, cold, controlled master. This was someone being unmade from the inside out. Dr. Marcus Webb learned of Dalton's condition through medical gossip among local physicians who were baffled by the case. He immediately recognized an opportunity. If he could examine Dalton and document symptoms that coincided with the whipping of a pregnant enslaved woman, he might have evidence of psychological guilt manifesting as physical illness, evidence that could support broader arguments about slavery's moral corruption. But getting access to Dalton would be difficult. The family was intensely private, and Dr. Weatherby guarded his patient jealously. Webb needed another approach. Meanwhile, at Canebrake Plantation, something else was happening that would create chaos. On August 23rd, 9 enslaved workers made a break for freedom, including Isaiah, Cassia's husband, and 2 other men who'd witnessed her whipping. They'd planned the escape carefully, waiting until overseers were distracted by Dalton's illness and the plantation's general disruption. They fled north toward Tennessee, hoping to reach free territory before slave catchers could organize pursuit. This wasn't coincidental timing. Isaiah later testified that Dalton's visible unraveling had created a crack in Canebrake's normally impenetrable security. When masters showed weakness, when the system's confident brutality wavered even slightly, opportunities emerged. The escape triggered immediate response. Luther Vance organized a search party, local slave catchers were hired, and advertisements offering rewards for the fugitives' capture appeared in newspapers across 3 states. But the pursuit was hampered by Dalton's incapacitation. The plantation's leadership was in disarray, making coordinated response difficult. Some of the fugitives would be recaptured within days. But Isaiah would make it further, carrying with him testimony about what had really happened under that oak tree. Isaiah ran for 11 days, moving only at night, hiding in swamps and forests. Sustained by help from other enslaved people along the route, and from a few white Quakers who maintained underground railroad stations despite tremendous danger. On September 3, 1857, he reached a Presbyterian mission in southeastern Tennessee, where abolitionist sympathizers provided shelter. There he encountered Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who'd fled Alabama weeks earlier and was trying to find witnesses who could corroborate his account of the Canebrake whipping. Isaiah's testimony was explosive. He could describe in detail what Cassia had said during the whipping, could explain that she'd invoked a protective curse passed down from her grandmother, a woman born in West Africa who'd carried spiritual traditions across the Middle Passage. He testified that Cassia had called upon ancestral spirits to afflict her tormentor with the same suffering he'd inflicted, to make him feel every lash, to strip away his ability to ignore the humanity of those he tortured. Whether supernatural or psychological, whether curse or conscience, something had been unleashed. Isaiah also brought news that Cassia had survived the whipping and given birth 2 weeks early to a daughter, both mother and child alive despite everything. But when Whitfield and abolitionist colleagues tried to bring Isaiah's testimony to authorities in Tennessee, they faced immediate resistance. Even in a border state, even among people with anti-slavery leanings, the testimony of an escaped slave against a respected white planter was treated with skepticism. Federal fugitive slave laws meant Isaiah could be captured and returned at any moment. The reversal was crushing. Truth mattered less than property rights, human testimony less than social hierarchy. But back in Alabama, events were spiraling beyond anyone's control. By early September, Edmund Dalton's condition had deteriorated so dramatically that his family called in specialists from Mobile and even one from New Orleans. These physicians examined Dalton and documented symptoms that defied conventional medical explanation. He described pain that moved across his body in patterns consistent with whipping. He suffered from what today we might call severe PTSD, with hallucinations and psychosomatic pain, and he showed signs of complete psychological breakdown. The New Orleans physician, Dr. Antoine Mercier, was so disturbed by the case that he began asking questions about potential psychological trauma. This led him to interview plantation staff, and eventually he heard whispers about the pregnant woman who'd been whipped. Mercier convinced Catherine Dalton to allow him access to plantation medical records, and what he found shocked even him. Documentation of extreme punishments, injuries that should have required hospital care but received minimal treatment, and a pattern of systematic abuse that went far beyond agricultural discipline. Mercier was no abolitionist. He owned enslaved people himself, but he was also a physician who couldn't ignore evidence before him. He compiled a report documenting his findings and shared it with Dr. Marcus Webb, whom he'd met during the medical consultation. Webb now had medical testimony from a respected Southern physician that could corroborate his own observations. Together, they approached local authorities with a request that scandalized Marengo County. They demanded an official inspection of canebrake plantation to investigate conditions that might be causing mental illness among the enslaved population and, by extension, affecting the plantation owners' psychological health. The resulting raid, conducted on September 18, 1857, uncovered documentation of horrors that shocked even hardened slaveholders. The inspection revealed Edmund Dalton's punishment ledgers, his correspondence with equipment manufacturers, his detailed notes on disciplinary techniques, all meticulously documented in his own hand. Here was evidence that couldn't be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda or enslaved people's unreliable testimony. This was a respected planter's own records proving systematic torture masquerading as management. Luther Vance, faced with potential legal consequences as authorities tried to find someone to blame for the scandal, began providing testimony about Dalton's orders and methods. He threw his employer to the wolves to save himself, describing in graphic detail specific punishments he'd administered under Dalton's direction. Dr. Silas Weatherby's medical records were subpoenaed, revealing discrepancies between his private notes and his official reports. He'd documented injuries as severe but certified them as minor to protect Dalton. Even Catherine Dalton, in an attempt to distance herself from her husband's collapse and protect her children's social standing, provided testimony about Edmund's obsessive record-keeping and his increasingly cruel behavior. In the years leading to 1857, what emerged was a portrait of a man who'd convinced himself that enslaved people weren't fully human, who'd built an elaborate intellectual framework to justify cruelty, who'd studied and refined techniques of oppression with the same attention he'd devoted to agricultural science. But the unmasking also revealed something more disturbing. Edmund Dalton wasn't an aberration. He was simply more meticulous in his documentation than other planters. His methods weren't significantly different from those employed across the South. He'd just been unlucky enough to whip a pregnant woman in front of a witness who'd reported it, and unlucky enough to suffer a psychological breakdown that drew medical scrutiny. The true horror wasn't that one man was cruel. It was that the entire system was built on such cruelty, normalized and legalized and woven into the fabric of Southern society. As investigators dug deeper into Dalton's records and correspondence, they uncovered connections that revealed the industrial scale of slavery's supporting infrastructure. His account books showed purchases from Nashville ironworks that specialized in restraint devices, from leather craftsmen in Mobile who manufactured whips to custom specifications, from Charleston merchants who supplied medical implements used in punishments. These weren't isolated transactions. They were part of a thriving economy built around human bondage and control. Dalton's correspondence revealed an informal network of planters across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia who shared techniques, discussed disciplinary challenges, and exchanged advice on maximizing productivity while minimizing the financial loss that came from working enslaved people to death. These letters, written in the casual language of agricultural business, discussed human beings as livestock, debated the relative costs of harsh discipline versus softer management approaches, and treated enslaved families as breeding stock. The network extended internationally. Dalton had sold cotton to British textile mills that certainly knew slavery produced their raw materials, but maintained careful ignorance about specific conditions. Insurance companies in London and New York had underwritten policies on his enslaved workers, literally betting on their survival and productivity. Northern banks had provided loans secured by human collateral. The investigation revealed that slavery wasn't just a Southern institution. It was a global economic system that required participation from financial centers in free states and European nations that publicly condemned the practice while privately profiting from it. Every link in the chain carried blood on its hands, but perhaps the most damning revelation wasn't about Edmund Dalton's individual cruelty or even the economic networks that sustained slavery. It was about the conspiracy of silence that had allowed such horrors to continue unquestioned for so long. Local clergy had visited Canebrake Plantation, had dined with the Daltons, had preached sermons justifying slavery as biblically ordained, and had never spoken publicly about the evidence of suffering visible in every scarred back, every haunted face. Physicians like Dr. Weatherby had examined injured enslaved people, had known that their injuries couldn't possibly be accidental, yet had signed certificates protecting their white clients while abandoning their oath to relieve suffering. County officials had toured plantations, had seen conditions that any honest observer knew were unconscionable, yet had certified compliance with minimal legal standards that were themselves grotesquely insufficient. Newspaper editors had published advertisements for runaway slaves that described scars and brands like livestock markings, had printed auction notices listing human beings alongside farm equipment, yet had attacked abolitionists as dangerous radicals threatening social order. Even Northerners who claimed to oppose slavery had worn cotton clothing, had invested in industries dependent on slave labor, had benefited from an economic system built on stolen labor and unpaid suffering. The conspiracy of silence wasn't about active cover-up. It was about willing blindness, about choosing comfort over conscience, about constructing elaborate justifications to avoid facing complicity. The investigation into canebrake threatened that comfortable silence, and powerful forces mobilized quickly to contain the damage before it spread too far. Edmund Dalton never recovered from his psychological collapse. By October 1857, he was completely incapacitated, unable to manage his plantation or affairs, subject to what his physicians called religious mania, in which he claimed to be tormented by visions of judgment and suffering. His family had him quietly institutionalized in a private asylum near Mobile, where he spent the remaining 4 years of his life in agony that no medication could touch. He died in 1861, just as the Civil War was beginning, never having escaped the invisible torment that had seized him after whipping Cassia. Whether you attribute his suffering to supernatural curse or to conscience finally breaking through decades of moral denial, the result was the same. He became a living example of unpaid debts and inescapable consequences. Luther Vance avoided prosecution by testifying against Dalton, then disappeared from Marengo County records entirely. Likely he moved west where his reputation wouldn't follow him. Dr. Silas Weatherby faced professional censure and lost much of his practice, though he was never criminally charged. Catherine Dalton sold Canebrake Plantation in 1858, moved her children to Charleston, and successfully rebuilt their social position by distancing the family from Edmund's tragic mental illness. She never acknowledged any wrongdoing in the plantation's management. Dr. Marcus Webb continued his medical practice but became increasingly outspoken in his opposition to slavery, eventually joining the Union Army as a surgeon during the Civil War. Reverend Thomas Whitfield spent the rest of his life in abolitionist circles, using the canebrake case as evidence in lectures and publications. Isaiah was recaptured in late 1857 and returned to Alabama under the Fugitive Slave Act, where he was sold to a Mississippi planter and separated from Cassia forever. And what of Cassia? She survived the whipping, survived childbirth 2 weeks premature, under conditions that should have killed both mother and child, and continued working at canebrake until the plantation was sold in 1858. She and her daughter were separated during the sale, a common practice designed to break enslaved families and maximize profit. Cassia was purchased by a planter in Louisiana. Her daughter's fate is unknown. She appears in no records after the sale ledger entry. Cassia herself lived to see emancipation in 1865, though freedom came too late to reunite her with the child who'd been torn from her arms, or with Isaiah, who died in Mississippi in 1863, never knowing whether his wife and daughter had survived. The moral of this story isn't simple or clean. It's not about supernatural justice punishing evil. The curse, if it was a curse, affected only Dalton, while the system that enabled him continued unchanged until war destroyed it. Cassia's suffering wasn't magically undone by her tormentor's collapse. Her daughter wasn't restored to her. Her husband wasn't saved. The real legacy of Canebrake Plantation is about how societies construct elaborate moral frameworks to justify atrocity, how economic interests trump human welfare, how those with power protect their own while sacrificing the vulnerable. It's about the gap between professed values and lived reality, between religious rhetoric and practiced cruelty, and it's about the cost of silence, how people who knew better chose comfort and complicity, how physicians abandoned their oaths, how ministers ignored their own scripture, how ordinary citizens participated in extraordinary evil through passive acceptance. So let me ask you, could something like this happen today? Could systems of exploitation and abuse exist in plain sight, protected by economic interests and social structures that make challenging them dangerous? Could we be living through our own conspiracy of silence, choosing comfortable ignorance over difficult truth? The mechanisms that allowed canebrake plantation to operate aren't as distant as we'd like to believe. The same human capacity for dehumanization, the same economic incentives that prioritize profit over people, the same social pressures that punish those who speak uncomfortable truths. All of these forces remain active in different forms. The question isn't whether Edmund Dalton was uniquely evil. The question is whether we're paying attention to the systems around us, whether we're willing to see suffering that our comfort depends on not seeing, whether we have the courage that people like Dr. Marcus Webb and Reverend Whitfield demonstrated. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. If this story disturbed you, good, it should. Now channel that discomfort into awareness. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to uncovering histories that powerful people would prefer stay buried. Drop a comment about your thoughts on collective responsibility and systemic evil. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how ordinary people participate in extraordinary horror. And next week, we're investigating something even darker. The Mississippi Medical School that purchased enslaved children for surgical experiments in 1849, and the doctor whose detailed journals documented atrocities committed in the name of science. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past.